Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Ariel, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Hello, dear listener, and welcome to another installment of Conan Chronicles. My name is Dan, your host as usual, and today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the 12th Conan story in publication history, The People of the Black Circle. Robert E. Howard is the writer of this one, and it was published across 3 issues of Weird Tales magazine in their 1934 September, October, and November issues. Our story begins in the luxurious palace of the King of Ventia, who is dying. The young king had suffered no wounds or poison, but nonetheless lays dying before his sister, the Devi, or Princess of Ventia, Yasmina. Yasmina laments that no doctor, mystic, or priest can identify why her brother is on the precipice of death. She suspects that only black magic could be responsible for his fate. As she looks on, her brother begins to call on her in an eerie voice. He says that wizards are attempting to draw his soul away from his body, and that if they are successful, they will damn his soul for all eternity. He begs for Yasmina to slay him before the wizards can trap his soul, and she cries out in despair. She doesn't think herself capable of slaying her beloved brother and king, but relents and obeys her brother's desperate commands. She pulls a jeweled dagger from her girdle, stabs the king directly through the heart, and collapses onto the floor in a fit of anguish and rage at the wizards who had taken her brother from her. Meanwhile, 2 figures listen to the Ventian priests singing a death hymn for the king elsewhere in the city atop a balcony. One is a man named Kerim Shah, a secret agent of King Yezdigerd, the king of Turan. The other, a man named Kemsa, a sorcerer, student, and servant of the Black Seers of Yimsha, a secret society of warlocks that trains adepts to become powerful sorcerers and priests. While the students of the Black Seers travel far across the kingdoms of the Hyborian Age to find work as mystics, many of them had come to settle in the kingdom of Turan. The Black Seers rarely interfere in the petty political affairs of man. However, the adepts who went on to embed themselves in Turanian society, becoming some of the most powerful and influential people in the king's court, had convinced the Black Circle to aid their king in his lust for power and conquest. The Turanian king Yezdigerd, seeking to expand the territory of his empire, desires the lands of Ventia for himself. To this end, the king sought to weaken the leadership of Ventia by assassination of its leader, and the Black Seers were happy to oblige. On the balcony, Kimsa tells the spy of the necromancy his masters had cast upon the young Ventian monarch to end his life. Kimsa says that the Black Seers had procured a lock of the king's hair from one of his former lovers, and used it in a dark ritual to rip the king's soul from his body. The scene then shifts to the Ventian city of Peshkauri, on the northeastern frontier of the kingdom. To the northwest, amongst the Himlian mountains and surrounding hills, tribal barbarians live by the knife and raid the border cities of Ventia. It is here that we meet Chunder Shan, the governor of this city, in his chambers, as he carefully writes a letter to his king. The governor is writing to inform His Excellency of the success they've had in their efforts to curb the barbarian threat on Venya's border. His letter says that 7 Afghuli local tribe leaders had been kidnapped and jailed within the city's walls, per the king's instructions. The governor had tried to negotiate with the high chieftain of the Afghulis, but had received no response from him thus far. He writes that the chieftain is not a native to the Himlian lands, and instead hails from some distant lands in the north. The name of this chieftain is Conan. As the governor reads over his letter carefully to ensure it's written in the proper language of diplomacy, a disguised now Queen Yasmina enters his chambers. Yasmina tells her governor that she believes the king had been murdered by way of dark magic by the Black Seers, who are known to reside in the mysterious Mount Yishma, one of the highest peaks in the Himlian mountains. The queen tells the governor that she thirsts for vengeance against these warlocks for her brother's death. She says that to accomplish this goal, she will need to employ additional military might beyond the current capacity of Ventia, as the might of the various hill tribes and the hostile terrain of the Himlians would severely diminish her army before they even reached Yimsha. What the queen requires is an alliance with one of the hill tribes to defend and guide her forces as they march on the lair of the evil sorcerers. The governor agrees with this notion, but says that even the barbaric hillmen fear the Black Seers, and it may be difficult, if not impossible, to secure the loyalty of any of the tribal leaders. The queen thinks for a moment, and then asks whether Conan, the chieftain of the Afghuli tribe, fears the Black Seers. The governor says that he doubts Conan fears anything, and the queen decides that Conan is the chieftain with whom she will negotiate, as they already have 7 of his hill chiefs in captivity as bargaining chips. With a plan made, the governor escorts Yasmina to her temporary chambers to retire for the night, as it is late and they can resume making preparations in the morning. The governor then returns to his chambers, and he hears something drop softly just outside the window of his room.
He looked up to see a figure loom briefly against the stars, and then a man dropped lightly into the room. "Shh," he warned. "Don't make a noise, or I'll send the devil a henchman." The invader was a tall man, at once strong and supple. He dressed like a hillman, but his dark features and blazing blue eyes did not match his garb. He was not an Easterner, but some barbarian from the West. But his aspect was as untamed and formidable as any of the hairy tribesmen who haunt the hills of Gulistan. "You come like a thief in the night," commented the governor, recovering some of his composure, although he remembered that there was no guard within call. Still, the hillman could not know that. "You are Conan?" "Who else? You sent word into the hills that you wish for me to come and parley with you. Well, by Crom, I've come. Keep away from that table, or I'll gut you. You have 7 of my men, he said abruptly. You refused the ransom I offered. What the devil do you want? Let us discuss terms, answered Chunder Shan cautiously. Terms? There was a timbre of dangerous anger in his voice. What do you mean? Haven't I offered you gold? Chunder Shan laughed. Gold? There is more gold in Peshkari than you ever saw. Why should we desire gold? It would be more to our advantage to hang these 7 thieves. Conan ripped out a sulphurous oath, and the long blade quivered in his grip as the muscles rose in ridges on his brown arm. I'll split your head like a ripe melon. A wild blue flame flickered in the hillman's eyes, but Chunder Shan shrugged his shoulders, though keeping an eye on the keen steel. You can kill me easily, and probably escape over the wall afterward, but that would not save the 7 tribesmen. My men would surely hang them, and these men are headmen among the Afghulis. I know it, snarled Conan. The tribe is baying like wolves at my heels because I have not procured their release. Tell me in plain words what you want, because, by Crom, if there's no other way, I'll raise a horde and lead it to the very gates of Peshkari. There is a mission you must perform, he said, choosing his words with as much care as if they had been razors. There... Conan sprung back, wheeling to face the door at the same instant, lips a-snarl. His barbarian ears had caught the quick tread of soft slippers outside the door. The next instant, the door was thrown open, and a slim, silk-robed form entered hastily, pulling the door shut, then stopping short at the sight of the hillman. Chunder Shan sprang up, his heart jumping into his mouth. "Devi!" he cried involuntarily, losing his head momentarily in his fright. Chunder Shan saw recognition and intent flame up in the fierce blue eyes. The governor shouted desperately and caught at his sword, but the hillman moved with the devastating speed of a hurricane. He sprang, knocked the governor sprawling with a savage blow of his knife hilt, swept up the astounded Devi in one brawny arm, and leapt for the window. Chunder Shan, struggling frantically to his feet, saw the man poise an instant on the sill in a flutter of silken skirts and white limbs that was his royal captive, and heard his fierce, exultant snarl, "Now dare to hang my men!"
While Conan swiftly escapes with Yasmina in his arms, and chaos erupts in the governor's castle, one of the queen's handmaidens quietly slips out of the fortress and runs out into the night. She makes a strange beckoning call to signal her arrival. Kimsa's head appears from a window directly above her and throws a rope down for the girl to climb. The girl tells Kimsa that Conan has kidnapped the queen and throws her arms around the sorcerer's neck affectionately. Kimsa's lover tells him not to inform the spy of what has transpired and use this knowledge for their own ends. The wizard hesitates at first, as disobeying an order of the Black Circle is tantamount to heresy. However, the girl persuades Kimsa to break away from his masters by killing the 7 hill chieftains in captivity, so that the governor of Peshkari loses his only bargaining chip that could result in the peaceful return of the queen to Vendhya. The couple schemes to find the queen themselves, kidnap her, and sell her to the king of Turan for a large fortune, enough to start their own kingdom. The Turanian king's spy, Kerim Shah, had been sleeping underneath the couple before their scheming roused him from his slumber. He hears the details of their plan, furiously writes a letter to his king, sends it off with a carrier pigeon, and escapes the tower before Kimsa and the handmaiden could decide to eliminate him. Meanwhile, Kimsa and the handmaiden glide to the prison quarters of Peshkari to murder the 7 Afghuli chieftains. The wizard summons a blaze of green fire that creates poisonous gas to suffocate the chieftains. After the last tribesman falls to Kimsa's sorcery, the pair departs for Afghanistan to find the queen. Meanwhile, Conan and Yasmina are ahead of the wizard and his lover, also on their way to Afghanistan, the lands where Conan rules as High Chieftain. Yasmina struggles against the barbarian's wild strength, but eventually relents, as her efforts only amuse her kidnapper. The pair eventually encounters a Wazuli hill chieftain named Yar Afzal, a friend of Conan's, along the road with a hunting party. The chief leads them into his village so that they might seek shelter, while Conan makes preparations to trade the queen back to her kingdom in exchange for his already dead chieftains. The next morning, Yasmina awakens to Conan learning that her Vendian soldiers were still on their trail, and a group of rebellious Wazulis shouting angrily at their hill chieftain. The rabble-rousers shout that they do not appreciate being forced to take such a risk in sheltering Conan and the queen, while Conan and the Afghulis are the ones who stand to benefit, while they receive nothing in return for their kindness. Yar Afzal makes an example of one of his men to put the rebellious Wazulis back in line. He seizes the man by the throat and chokes him until his face turns black. Afzal throws the man to the ground, and he gasps for breath, having barely survived his chieftain's assault. The chieftain then tells the man to go down into the valley, where Wazuli scouts lie in wait, hoping to catch a glimpse of any Ventians marching on the village in time for the Wazulis to prepare their defenses. The man shuffles off, but before he can reach the valley, he encounters Kimsa waiting for him on the road. The sorcerer spellbinds the man, plunging him into a deep trance of obedience. Kimsa hands the Wazuli a small ball of polished jade and instructs him to bring the ball back to Yar Afzal. When the man returns, Afzal chastises him for disobeying orders and snatches the jade ball from his hands. In Afzal's grip, the ball transforms into a poisonous spider that bites the chieftain and kills him instantly. In the absence of their leader, the rebellious Wazulis scream that it is time for Conan to die, and a battle ensues. Conan valiantly fights off a few of the Wazulis, but rushes to the village's horse stalls with Yasmina, as it would be impossible for one man to defeat an entire village of barbarians. Conan steals a black stallion and charges through a secret passage Yar Afzal had shown him once, while the hill chief was drunk. The pair make a swift escape into a ravine, leaving the Wazuli village behind as they continue on towards Afghanistan. Further along the road towards the Afghuli lands, Conan tells Yasmina that it would probably be a good idea if she ditched her royal garb, ripped and tattered by their journey, for a more unassuming outfit. Conan tells her that a Galzai village is nearby. Women of the tribe frequently walk the road thereon to retrieve water. He tells her that he will trade some coin for the clothes of the next woman who passes. They manage to find a woman shortly after, and Conan trades for her clothes. After Yasmina changes into the garb of a common hill woman, the barbarian notices how beautiful she is for the first time. He spanks her in admiration, in keeping with his barbarous sexism. But the queen takes no offense and chalks it up to a cultural difference. For the first time, feelings for the barbarous man swell in her heart as they continue towards the lair of the sorcerers. However, her mind is distracted from these feelings she feels towards Conan as the towering peak of Mount Yishma appears on the horizon. The pair is a full day and night's ride away from the mountain, when suddenly, Conan's black steed refuses to move forward, and a strange figure appears on the road before them. It is Kimsa. He shoots a mystical glare into Conan's eyes, attempting to hypnotize him, but he is unable to break the barbarian's mind. Conan lunges at the sorcerer, and the two engage in combat, Conan slashing his knife, and Kimsa returning with his fists, imbued with the power of black magic. Before the two can decide the outcome of their confrontation, a strange force intervenes.
Down the mountain slopes, like a whirl of shining dust blown before the wind, a crimson conoid cloud came dancing. It struck the ledge between Conan and Kimsa, and the Raksha gave back with a stifled cry. Then, without warning, it was gone, vanished as a bubble vanishes when burst. There on the ledge stood 4 men. They were not ghosts or phantoms. They were 4 tall men with shaven, vulture-like heads, and black robes that hid their feet. Their hands were concealed by their wide sleeves. They stood in silence, their naked heads nodding slightly in unison. All 4 of the men in black robes stared at Kimsa. Their vulture-like faces were immobile, their eyes introspective and contemplative. But Kimsa shook like a man in an ague. His feet were braced on the rock, his calves straining as if in physical combat. Sweat ran in streams down his dark face. His right hand locked on something under his brown robe so desperately that the blood ebbed from that hand and left it white. His left hand fell on the shoulder of Gitara and clutched in agony, like the grasp of a drowning man. She did not flinch or whimper, though his fingers dug like talons into her firm flesh. Conan had witnessed hundreds of battles in his wild life, but never one like this, wherein 4 diabolical wills sought to beat down one lesser but equally devilish will that opposed them. But he only faintly sensed the monstrous quality of that hideous struggle. With his back to the wall, driven to bay by his former masters, Kimsa was fighting for his life with all the dark power, all the frightful knowledge they had taught him through long, grim years of neophytism and vassalage. He reeled before the merciless impact of those hypnotic eyes, but he held his ground. His features were distorted into a bestial grin of agony, and his limbs were twisted as on a rack. It was a war of souls, of frightful brains steeped in lore forbidden to men for 1,000,000 years, of mentalities which had plumbed the abysses and explored the dark stars where spawned the shadows. Yasmina understood this better than did Conan, and she dimly understood why Kimsa could withstand the concentrated impact of those 4 hellish wills, which might have blasted into atoms the very rock on which he stood. The reason was the girl that he clutched with the strength of his despair. She was like an anchor to his staggering soul, battered by the waves of those psychic emanations. They realized that before he did, and one of them turned his gaze from the Raksha full upon Gitara. There was no battle there. The girl shrank and wilted like a leaf in the drought. Irresistibly impelled, she tore herself from her lover's arms before he realized what was happening. The girl went backward, walking like an automaton, and Kimsa reeled drunkenly after her, hands vainly outstretched, groaning, slobbering in his pain, his feet moving heavily like dead things. On the very brink she paused, standing stiffly, her heels on the edge, and he fell on his knees and crawled whimpering toward her, groping for her to drag her back from destruction. And just before his clumsy fingers touched her, one of the wizards laughed, like the sudden bronze note of a bell in hell. The girl reeled suddenly, and, consummate climax of exquisite cruelty, reason and understanding flooded back into her eyes, which flared with awful fear. She screamed, clutched wildly at her lover's straining hand, and then, unable to save herself, fell headlong with a moaning cry. One of the Rakshas stepped forward and stamped his foot, and as he stamped, there came a rumbling that grew swiftly to a grinding roar. Where his foot struck, a crevice opened in the solid rock that widened instantly. Then, with a deafening crash, a whole section of the ledge gave way. There was a last glimpse of Khemsa, with arms wildly upflung, and then he vanished amidst the roar of the avalanche that thundered down into the abyss. The four looked contemplatively at the ragged edge of rock that formed the new rim of the precipice, and then turned suddenly. Conan, thrown off his feet by the shudder of the mountain, was rising, lifting Yasmina, and now the wizards had turned toward him. They raised their arms, and to his horrified sight they saw their outlines fading, dimming, becoming hazy and nebulous, as a crimson smoke billowed around their feet and rose about them. He heard Yasmina scream, and the stallion cried out like a woman in pain. The Devi was torn from his arm, and as he lashed out with his knife blindly, a terrific blow like a gust of storm wind knocked him sprawling against a rock. Dazedly, he saw a crimson conoid cloud spinning up and over the mountain slopes. Yasmina was gone, and so were the four men in black. Only the terrified stallion shared the ledge with him.
The barbarian recovers from the shock of the wizard battle he had just witnessed, and rides like a thunderbolt towards Mount Yimsha after the wizards and Yasmina. After racing down the path for some time, to Conan's surprise, he finds a horde of his own Afghuli soldiers waiting in a valley below him. He desperately cries out to his men, hastily ordering them to follow him to Yimsha. To his surprise, however, the men simply shout back at him, calling Conan a traitor for failing to rescue the 7 hill chieftains. Word had reached Afghulistan that the 7 hill chieftains Conan had pledged to return to his land safely lie dead in their cell. The soldiers are angry that their foreign chieftain had ordered them to refrain from raiding the city of Peshkhauri to recapture their brothers before they were murdered. Their current plan is to march on the city now to avenge the death of their chieftains. After Conan notices that his troops can't possibly reach him in any short amount of time from his vantage point high above them, he continues on the road to Yimsha alone. Shortly thereafter, the barbarian encounters the mangled but still living Khemsa lying in the road. The defeated wizard pleads with Conan to avenge him and the death of his handmaiden lover. To help the barbarian in his seemingly impossible quest against the Black Circle, Khemsa gives Conan a magic girdle blessed by a Stygian priest that he says will aid Conan in his quest. Just before he dies, the sorcerer tells Conan that if he reaches the chamber of the Black Seers, he should smash the crystal globe with the 4 golden pomegranates within, and beware the master of the Black Circle's transmutations. Conan hesitates at first, but decides to take Khemsa at his word. He puts the magic girdle on underneath his own and continues along the road to Yimsha. Not long afterwards, Conan encounters Kerim Shah, the agent of Turan's king, with a band of Iraxi warriors on the hunt for Yasmina in an effort to kidnap her for their king. After some harsh words between them, the two come to an agreement that they share a common goal: finding the queen. Whoever gets to keep her is a matter for after the Black Seers are defeated. Conan agrees to pledge his sword to the Iraxi forces for now, and the band goes together toward the wizard's castle. While Yasmina is held captive by the evil master of the Black Circle, he tortures her by making her relive all of the past lives her soul has lived since the beginning of time. Thankfully, Conan and the band of warriors swiftly reach the grounds of the Evil Order's castle. The acolytes of the Black Seers marshal their mystic defenses against the warriors. These acolytes summon animals and hurl clouds of hellfire down at the invaders, but the resilient band pushes through and makes it past the castle's outer defenses. The acolytes flee back towards the castle through a chasm of suffocating mist, which Conan is able to navigate, and the Araxai forces catch up with the acolytes. A melee ensues. As all of the magical efforts to repel the invaders had failed, the acolytes lunge to meet the warriors in battle, knives in hand. A few of the Araxai warriors fall, but they quickly dispose of the acolytes and breach the gates of the castle. As Conan leads the warriors inside, a robed figure appears before them.
He lifted his head and saw on the tier above him a tall black-robed figure, naked head nodding slightly as he stared down. His whole attitude suggested mockery and malignity. Quick as a flash, the Araxai bent his bow and loosed, and the arrow streaked upward to strike full in the black-robed breast. The mocking smile did not alter. The seer plucked out the missile and threw it back at the bowman, not as a weapon is hurled, but with a contemptuous gesture. The Araxai dodged, instinctively throwing up his arm. His fingers closed on the revolving shaft. Then he shrieked. In his hand, the wooden shaft suddenly writhed. Its rigid outline became pliant, melting in his grasp. He tried to throw it from him, but it was too late. He held a living serpent in his naked hand, and already it had coiled about his wrist, and its wicked wedge-shaped head darted at his muscular arm. He screamed again, and his eyes became distended, his features purple. He went to his knees, shaken by an awful convulsion, and then lay still.
Conan attempts to rush at the wizard, but an invisible barrier seems to exist between him and the robed figure. Instead, he leads the warriors through an alternate doorway that leads into a grand chamber.
He strode into the great hall, flanked with tall, glassy columns. 100 feet from the door began the broad, jade-green steps of a stair that tapered toward the top like the side of a pyramid. What lay beyond that stair he could not tell, but between him and its shimmering foot stood a curious altar of gleaming black jade. 4 great golden serpents twined their tails about this altar and reared their wedge-shaped heads in the air, facing the 4 quarters of the compass like the enchanted guardians of a fabled treasure. But on the altar, between the arching necks, stood only a crystal globe filled with a cloudy, smoke-like substance, in which floated 4 golden pomegranates. The sight stirred some dim recollection in his mind. Then Conan heeded the altar no longer, for on the lower steps of the stair stood 4 black-robed figures. He had not seen them come. They were simply there, tall, gaunt, their vulture heads nodding in unison, their feet and hands hidden by their flowing garments. One lifted his arm, and the sleeve fell away, revealing his hand. And it was not a hand at all. Conan halted in mid-stride, compelled against his will. He had encountered a force differing subtly from Kemsa's mesmerism, and he could not advance, though he felt it in his power to retreat if he wished. His companions had likewise halted, and they seemed even more helpless than he, unable to move in either direction. The Cimmerian, his veins bulging in his temples with his efforts to break past the unseen barrier that held him, was suddenly aware of allied forces, unseen but waking into life about him. This realization came without warning, but so powerfully that he could not doubt his instinct. His left hand slid involuntarily under his Becariot belt and closed on the Stygian girdle, and as he gripped it, he felt new strength flood his numbed limbs. The will to live was a pulsing white-hot fire, matched by the intensity of his burning rage. A fierce, involuntary cry burst from his lips, as he leapt with the explosive suddenness of pent-up ferocity. His left hand gripped the sorcerer's girdle as a drowning man grips a floating log, and the long knife was a sheen of light in his right. The men on the steps did not move. They watched calmly, cynically. If they felt surprise, they did not show it. Another dozen strides would carry him to the steps where the sneering demon stood. He drew his breath deep, his fury rising redly as his charge gathered momentum. He was hurtling past the altar with its golden serpents when, like a levin flash, there shot across his mind again, as vividly as if spoken in his external ear, the cryptic words of Khemsa. "Break the crystal ball!" Hisses filled his ears as the golden serpents, suddenly vibrant with hideous life, writhed and smote at him. But he was fired to the speed of a maddened tiger. A whirl of steel sheared through the hideous trunks that waved toward him, and he smote the crystal sphere again and yet again, and the globe burst with a noise like a thunderclap, raining fiery shards on the black marble, and the gold pomegranates, as if released from captivity, shot upward toward the lofty roof and were gone. A mad screaming, bestial and ghastly, was echoing through the great hall. On the steps writhed 4 black-robed figures, twisting in convulsions, froth dripping from their livid mouths. Then, with one frenzied crescendo of inhuman ululation, they stiffened and lay still, and Conan knew that they were dead.
Conan, Kerim Shah, and the remaining Irakzai have little time to celebrate the barbarians' murder of the Wizards of the Black Circle before their master appears in the chamber.
"I am the master of Yimsha." His voice was like the chime of a temple bell, but a note of cruel mirth ran through it. His robe, too, was black, but of richly embroidered velvet, and there was a velvet cap on his head. His face was calm and not unhandsome. "Where is Yasmina?" demanded Kerim Shah. The master laughed down at him. "What is that to you, dead man? Have you so quickly forgotten my strength, once lent to you, that you come armed against me, you poor fool? I think I will take your heart, Kerim Shah." He held out his hand as if to receive something, and the Turanian cried out sharply, like a man in mortal agony. He reeled drunkenly, and then, with a splintering of bones, a rending of flesh and muscle, and a snapping of mail links, his breast burst outward with a shower of blood, and through the ghastly aperture something red and dripping shot through the air into the master's outstretched hand, as a bit of steel leaps to the magnet. The Turanian slumped to the floor and lay motionless, and the master laughed and hurled the object to fall before Conan's feet, a still quivering human heart.
Conan seethes with anger and charges at the warlock. He's able to land a blow on the master before he disappears, and Conan charges up the stairs toward whatever mystery lies above the Great Hall. He hears Yasmina scream as he runs into the room, and emerges into a chamber where the queen is being held captive. Towering over her is the master of the Black Circle, but this time in the form of a gigantic serpent. Conan hurls the knife in his hand at the snake and stabs it through the neck. He rushes forward, pulls a second dagger from his girdle, and begins to engage it in battle. The barbarian wounds the master serpent severely, forcing it to flee. Conan runs to Yasmina, and the two embrace, kissing. The Cimmerian tells her that they must flee before the master has time to lick his wounds and torment them again, and the pair rush out of the evil castle. As they're riding away, Yasmina tells Conan that she wishes for him to accompany her back to Vendhya, where she will ensure that he is safe from his rebellious Afghuli men. Conan tells her that he prefers Yasmina as she is now, dressed in the clothes of a common woman, without the pride and decadence that comes with being a queen. The barbarian tells her that he will either take her safely to one of his friends in the hills and either recapture the Afghulis as his tribe, or ride with her north to the steppes to make her his savage, barbarian queen. In this moment, the two lovers realize that they cannot walk the same path. Yasmina's loyalty to her kingdom and people outweighs her love of her barbaric protector. Soon after the two have this realization that they are not destined to be together, they stumble upon a large battle between the horde of rebellious Afghulis Conan had met earlier and an army of invading Turanians, seeking to march on to Vendhya, left weak and vulnerable without a monarch to lead the kingdom. Suddenly, to Yasmina's excitement, the riders of Vendhya, who had heard news of the marching Turanian army, arrive to head the invaders off while they remain in the savage hill country. The two agree that they must join their respective factions and marshal their forces together to repel the invaders.
"You win," he grunted. "Ride like the devil." She wheeled away down the left-hand slope, and he ran swiftly along the ridge until he reached the long, ragged cleft that was the defile in which the fight raged. Blades were whickering and clanging about him, horses rearing and stamping, helmet plumes nodding among turbans that were stained crimson. As he hit, he yelled like a wolf, caught a gold-worked rein, and, dodging the sweep of a scimitar, drove his long knife upward through the rider's vitals. In another instant, he was in the saddle, yelling ferocious orders to the Afghulis. They stared at him stupidly for an instant. Then, as they saw the havoc his steel was wreaking among their enemies, they fell to their work again, accepting him without comment. In that inferno of licking blades and spurting blood, there was no time to ask or answer questions. As he hacked and smote like a man possessed, Conan had time for some chilling doubts. Would Yasmina keep her word? She had but to join her warriors, turn southward, and leave him and his band to perish. But at last, after what seemed centuries of desperate battling, in the valley outside there rose another sound above the clash of steel and yells of slaughter. And then, with a burst of trumpets that shook the walls, the rushing thunder of hoofs, 5,000 riders of Vendhya smote the hosts of Secunderam. "You kept your word, Devi," he roared. "By Crom, though, I had some bad seconds down in that gorge."
The combined efforts of Conan, with his savage Afghulis, and the regal Queen Yasmina, with her civilized cavalry forces, defeat the Turanians and secure the safety of both of their lands. At the end of the battle, where the civilized and the barbarous united to secure peace, the chieftain and the queen part ways to end the story. The People of the Black Circle is the first of the late period Conan stories that we're going to be covering on the show, and it's certainly the most narratively complex of the Howard stories that I've covered so far. It took me a bit longer to relay the narrative of this one than usual, so if you're not fond of listening to that part of the show, I apologize. But I had to do that because it's a longer story than any of the other ones I've covered. The People of the Black Circle is not a short story. It's long enough to qualify as a novella, and that's why it was published across 3 issues of Weird Tales rather than simply being a single one-and-done like the prior Howard stories. Amongst Conan fans, this story is considered to be an undisputed classic, and in my view, it certainly deserves that reputation. The People of the Black Circle is an epic quest across vast lands inspired by the cultures of the Indian subcontinent and their Middle Eastern neighbors to the northwest, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Iraq. It's a story of magic, political intrigue, war, love, death, and vengeance. It has sort of everything you'd want out of a fantasy story like this, and I couldn't have been more delighted while I was reading it. Howard, taking inspiration from the various cultures of India and the Middle East, also gave this one a unique flavor when compared to some of the other stories that are inspired by Europe's past. Fantasy stories written by writers from what we know today as the West often take inspiration from medieval Europe and ancient European civilizations like Greece and Rome. In this story, Howard brings us on a journey that begins in Venya, a kingdom inspired by India. This is evident from things such as their word for queen, Devi, being the name of an ancient Indian goddess that was eventually incorporated into the Hindu pantheon when that religion was founded. We then see Conan and Yasmina ride into the Himalayan mountains, which is of course the Hyborian Age version of the Himalayas, which in modern day separates the Indian subcontinent from the Tibetan plateau to the northeast. There's also the fact that the various barbaric tribes of the hill country have names derived from the nations that comprise the Middle Eastern region to the northwest of India today. For example, the Afghulis, Conan's tribe, are basically the Afghans. The Izraqi, the sworn enemies of the Afghulis, and the tribe that joins forces with Karim Shah by the end of the story are the Iraqis, and other tribes also take inspiration from the various peoples of this region of the world. The inspiration that Howard draws on from these cultures creates a very rich and interesting setting for the story that paints a vivid picture of what these people and the places they live are like in the mind's eye. The story's setting makes this one feel like something more akin to the folk tales of Arabian Nights, rather than the various legends of European antiquity and its medieval period. And this was no coincidence. Robert E. Howard was fascinated by Middle Eastern and Indian culture. Many of his non-Conan stories took place in the Middle East and Afghanistan specifically, such as The Sowers of the Thunder, The Shadow of the Vulture, and his various tales of a character named El Barak. The Black Seers themselves, in appearance, certainly conjured into my mind thoughts about Sufism, a mystical sect of Islam that appeared in the very early years of Islamic history when the religion was founded in the 6th century. Sufi orders still exist today, and while less popular than they once were in prior centuries, still teach that closeness with Allah brings an advanced form of spirituality. Those who are able to attain this higher level of connection to the spiritual gain magic powers that can be wielded in the name of Allah. The way that the Black Seers organized their Order of the Black Circle also reminded me of a particular occult organization that came to prominence in England in the 19th century. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was a secret society of occultists that was formed in the late 1800s by some Freemasons and already practicing English occultists. They are perhaps the most famous and influential occult organization in the modern times, as their teachings still inform much of how aspiring mystics practice magic. Within a few years of the organization's founding, the Golden Dawn counted members amongst every social class in Victorian England. They infiltrated pretty much every sect of the society. The order was organized with a hierarchy similar to the Order of the Black Circle we see in this story. The first rung on the Golden Dawn's totem pole of sorts was the First Order, and this group consisted of the various neophytes, new recruits, and students of the order. Within this group there were a variety of ranks. As students and newcomers grew more proficient with their occult powers, they were promoted upwards. We see in the people of the Black Circle that these Black Seers have a sect of neophytes and apprentices that defend the outer walls of the castle on Mount Yimsha from Conan and the Orakzai warriors that accompany him. The second level of the order was called the Second Order, which consisted of adepts. These were sort of the intermediates of the order. The Third Order consisted of the highest-ranking members of the organization that were not masters, similar to the 4 seers that Conan defeats by smashing the crystal ball in their castle towards the end of the story. The highest members of the order were what the Golden Dawn referred to as the Secret Chiefs. These were the highly secretive leaders of the order, which most members, save the Third Order, rarely if ever communicated with, let alone met. Some amongst the order believed these secret chiefs to be cosmic beings who had the power to divine the fate of the universe, while others believed them to be actual human beings who were just highly secretive. Some evidence does exist to suggest that the secret chiefs were actual people, but they are still largely shrouded in mystery. Some of the more famous members of this secret society of occultists included Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Bram Stoker, the author of the original Dracula novel, and Aleister Crowley, who was a very famous occultist in his day. I suppose many modern people not versed in these sort of occultists may know him as the subject of the Ozzy Osbourne song Mr. Crowley, and he also appears at the back of the crowd on the cover art of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper and the Lonely Hearts Club Band. There are many other famous members of this order, but those are the three that stuck out to me. Members of the Golden Dawn studied a variety of magical concepts and claimed to have proficiency in the arts of scrying, astral projection, alchemy, astrology, tarot card reading, geomancy, and control of the 4 classical elements: wind, water, fire, and earth. The Black Seers in this story exhibit many of the same powers. At the beginning of the story, when Kimsa is discussing the method by which the Black Seers have partially ripped the soul of Venya's king from his body, he tells him that the leaders of the Black Circle have divined this moment as the perfect time to act, because they had read the cosmos and determined that a necromancy this powerful could only be accomplished when the stars are properly aligned, demonstrating their proficiency with astrology. The acolytes that defend the outer defenses of the wizard's castle also hurl misty clouds of hellfire down on their enemies, demonstrating their control of at least the classical element of fire. The Black Circle's involvement in politics in this story, assisting with the assassination of one king for the benefit of another, reminded me of yet another English secret society that was established a century before the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, who some may be familiar with if you're a fan of one of my favorite comic books, the X-Men. The Hellfire Club was a secret society of English elites established in the 18th century. At the meetings of the Hellfire Club, some of the most powerful politicians and economic elites of their day met to safely engage in acts perceived by wider society as immoral. Think the cult from Eyes Wide Shut, but with not only sex. What was discussed at meetings of the Hellfire Club was highly secretive, but I for one think it's unlikely that these meetings didn't involve some sort of plotting amongst the powerful to accomplish mutual goals in the political and economic realms. One of the few things known about this shadowy organization was they also had ties to another elite secret society in England called the Order of the Second Circle, which is a complete and utter mystery. We know little to nothing about what that organization was. The parallels that Howard draws with real secret societies that have existed throughout history adds a level of authenticity and real menace to the wizards of the Black Circle as the villains of this story. The evil sorcerers in this story are a far cry from the stock, cackling warlocks from the early Howard Conan stories that we saw, and they are a much welcome change. I also loved how magic is portrayed and used in this story. The magic of Howard's world is not the standard sort of role-playing game magic, where wizards are hurling thunderbolts or something. The wizards of the Hyborian Age have subtler methods. They send clouds of dangerous mist to waft at their enemies. They travel as a mist, like Count Dracula. They can transform into and control beasts, and they can dominate the minds of people and bend them to their will. I like how low-key the wizards of the Hyborian world are in their power. Their powers are often subtle, but they also feel no less powerful. I included the passage about one of the wizards turning an arrow into a deadly serpent in my retelling of the story, because that part of the story showed me that either John Milius, Oliver Stone, or both of them read this story and must have enjoyed it. In the 1982 Conan the Barbarian movie, Thulsa Doom, played by James Earl Jones, does the opposite of what the wizard in this passage does with his magic powers on a few occasions. He turns a serpent into an arrow that cannot miss the target he designates. I always thought that this was a really cool use of the snake motif that the character has in the film, and I didn't realize that it came from Conan's source material until reading this story. Yasmina is also great in this story. She's one of the most fully realized Conan love interests that we've had so far. Yasmina is a woman that's well versed in the arts of politics, has a fierce dedication to her family and kingdom, and proves to be a proficient general in the final battle of the story. When Yasmina first begins her journey with Conan, she feels a bit of superficial attraction to his body, and notices that his gaze hangs on her for a bit longer than a man who is totally uninterested. The shrewd politician that she is, she considers using this to her advantage. She thinks that she may be able to seduce Conan into assisting her with her quest to destroy the Black Seers. She doesn't get the opportunity to act on this idea before she begins to develop real feelings for him, but the queen is hardly a stock damsel in distress. She's an incredibly cunning woman, a quality that politicians like herself need in order to survive the blood sport that is the political arena. While she isn't as well suited for Conan as Belit, for example, which is explicitly spelled out by the end of the story when they realize they can't be together. However, one can see why these two relate to each other after Yasmina spends some time journeying with the barbarian. Yasmina is a woman on a quest for vengeance. Her desire to see the Black Seers destroyed is a quest born purely out of spite. This is, of course, not unfamiliar to Conan. He is a man that has intimate knowledge of the hatred that inspires quests of vengeance. He's been on many himself. I actually quite liked that despite this connection that the two of them share, they're separated at the end by the allegiances they both have to their respective people and cultures. It's a bit of a melancholy ending, despite the fact that they won the battle against the Turanians at the end. Yasmina is probably my second favorite female character that has appeared in these Conan stories thus far, just slightly behind Belit. Overall, I'd have to say that the people of the Black Circle has finally dethroned the Slithering Shadow as my favorite Conan story that we've covered on this show thus far. It's a much more meaty story. Howard gets to flesh out all the ideas he brings to this one with adequate focus and detail due to the longer length of the story. The Wizards of the Black Circle are certainly the best villains we've seen in a Conan story so far, I think. And this story, more than any of the other ones, feels like an epic quest worthy of mythological legends. Alright, so we've come to the end of this review and retrospective of the People of the Black Circle, folks. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, but as always, before I let you go, I'd like to say a few words regarding how you can check out this story yourself and support the show if you're so inclined. In the description below, I've included a link to a free audiobook version of this story that I excerpted in this episode, so if you'd like to listen to it, feel free. This is a Libravox recording reading of the story, and I think the narrator does a really good job, so definitely check it out. If you enjoyed this episode of the show, it would mean quite a bit to me if you subscribed to the channel, liked the video, and posted your thoughts on this story, my video, or anything Conan the Barbarian related in the comments below. All of these kinds of engagements with the channel's videos help Conan Chronicles get recommended to people as they surf YouTube looking for things to watch. Your engagements help the show cut through the rest of the videos that are uploaded on YouTube every day, so I definitely would appreciate and do appreciate all of you who engage with the videos in that manner. We also have a Patreon for Conan Chronicles where you can support the show monetarily. Any amount you can chip in really helps. The Patreon episode of the Grog House podcast for this month will be going up likely this week before the end of April. So if you'd like access to that episode, definitely check it out. I have a free sampler on the channel of kind of what the show is like. So if you want to check out that episode that I did with Josh, my co-host for the show, on the Tower of the Elephant comic book adaptations, you can kind of get a flavor for what you get for subscribing to the Patreon. I also have a Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram page for the show, so if you never want to miss an episode, get updates on the show and see some of the awesome pieces of Conan artwork that I find while I'm scrounging the internet for images to use for the show, check out those pages. With all of that out of the way, the last thing I'd like to do before I let you go is invite you, dear listener, to join me for the next episode. In the next episode, we're going to be taking a look at the 13th Conan story in publication order, A Witch Shall Be Born. Until next we meet, dear listener, I bid you farewell.
The great head towered above the man who faced it, and then darted down, the venom-dripping jaws gaping wide. But Conan had plucked the dagger from his girdle, and he stabbed upward as the head dipped down. The point tore through the lower jaw and transfixed the upper, pinning them together. The next instant, the great trunk had looped itself about the Cimmerian, as the snake, unable to use its fangs, employed its remaining form of attack. Conan's left arm was pinioned among the bone-crushing folds, but his right was free. Bracing his feet to keep upright, he stretched forth his hand, gripped the hilt of the long knife jutting from the serpent's neck, and tore it free in a shower of blood. As if divining his purpose with more than bestial intelligence, the snake writhed and knotted, seeking to cast its loops about his right arm. But with the speed of light, the long knife rose and fell, shearing halfway through the reptile's giant trunk. Before he could strike again, the great pliant loops fell from him and the monster dragged itself across the floor, gushing blood from its ghastly wounds.